All right, so let's dive into this ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, huh? After 15 months of conflict, no less. We're going deep today with some articles from the Times of Israel. And it's more than just what's on the surface, you know. We're looking at the whole picture, the politics behind it all.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at how international relations really work, especially with U.S. elections thrown into the mix. This isn't just a simple ceasefire, this agreement, it's a whole three-phase plan.
3 phases, okay. What are we talking about here? What's in each phase? And what could go wrong, right?
Well, first you've got the classic ceasefire, 6 weeks to cool things down, stop the immediate violence. But then phase 2, that's where it gets interesting. We're talking prisoner exchange. 33 hostages, including women and children, some in rough shape, they'll be released. And Israel, they'll be releasing about 1,000 Palestinian security prisoners in return.
Wow, okay. That's a huge exchange. Lots of political risk for everyone involved, don't you think?
Definitely. This kind of exchange, it carries a lot of weight for both sides. And then there's phase 3, the long game. That's when they start talking about a permanent ceasefire and rebuilding Gaza. Sounds hopeful, but I'm sure there are some big challenges ahead.
For sure. And these articles, they really get into how the Biden administration and even the incoming Trump administration were involved behind the scenes. Let's start with Biden. It seems like they gave a lot of military aid to Israel, but maybe had trouble influencing their strategy, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Biden, they had some wins, like convincing Netanyahu to let aid into Gaza, maybe even stopping an attack on Rafah by holding back certain weapons and getting those hostages released. But there was also some pushback. The articles mention Netanyahu resisting their advice on how to stabilize Gaza after the fighting, preventing Hamas from regaining strength.
It makes you wonder, was some of that resistance because of the U.S. elections going on? One official even said domestic politics might have tied Biden's hands a bit. Talk about a tough spot.
Domestic politics always have an impact. That's just how it is. But then you've got the Trump administration coming in, adding another layer of complexity to everything. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, he met with Netanyahu in Jerusalem just days before the ceasefire was announced. And some are saying it was a tense meeting.
Tense is never a word you want to hear in these situations. What was the deal with that meeting, and what could it mean for U.S.-Israel relations down the line?
Well, a few Arab officials have suggested that Witkoff, in that one meeting, was able to convince Netanyahu to compromise on things that Biden had been pushing for all year. So you have the incoming administration maybe having more influence than the current president. That's a pretty fascinating dynamic.
No kidding, that says a lot about the power dynamics at play. And on top of that, you have Trump saying he'll use this momentum to expand the Abraham Accords, maybe even bring in Saudi Arabia. Our listeners are already familiar with the Accords, but expanding them like this, that could really change the game.
Oh, absolutely. The Abraham Accords, that was a big accomplishment for Trump, normalizing relations between Israel and those Arab states. But getting Saudi Arabia involved, that would be huge. Geopolitically, it would be a whole new ballgame. It could reshape the entire Middle East.
Yeah, what a legacy move that would be. But hold on, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's not forget about the details of this ceasefire deal. There are still some big things to work out, like the IDF pulling out of Gaza. The articles say that's a major sticking point.
You're right, that's a crucial piece. Mediators are actually waiting for Israel to provide a map, showing exactly how and where they'll withdraw their troops. That's important because it directly affects how much control Hamas will have in the region. It shows how these details can make or break the whole agreement.
It's one thing to agree to a ceasefire in principle, right? But actually putting it into practice, that's where the real challenges are. Let's dig into those details because that's where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. The details are where we start to see the potential of this deal, but also the potential problems. And that's what we'll be looking at as we continue our deep dive. Welcome back. Glad to have you with us as we unpack this Gaza ceasefire. So we were talking about the finer points of the agreement, and there's one that really stands out, probably the most controversial. The prisoner exchange. We know it's 33 hostages for about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, but it's who those prisoners are that's causing all the buzz.
Right. You have to wonder who's on that list and how will their release be seen, especially by those who think it's like giving in to terrorism.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? These Palestinian prisoners, they're not all the same. Some are considered security prisoners by Israel, meaning they were involved in violence or what Israel calls terrorism. Others are more like political prisoners, detained for opposing the occupation. Even the word prisoner, it means different things to different people in this context.
So you have these clashing narratives and the potential for more conflict down the line. What's the strategy here for both sides? What are they hoping to gain from this exchange?
For both Israel and Hamas, it's a risky move. Israel, they get their citizens back, and that's a powerful incentive for any government. But there's also the risk of emboldening Hamas or even other groups. That's causing a lot of debate within Israel. Hamas, on the other hand, they want to look stronger, more legitimate in the eyes of Palestinians. Releasing these prisoners helps with that. But if this ceasefire falls apart, they could face a backlash from their own people.
It's a balancing act for sure. And you mentioned earlier that this deal looks a lot like one they tried back in May 2024, but those talks went nowhere. What happened then, and what does it tell us about what's happening now?
The fact that those talks failed shows just how deep the mistrust runs between these two sides. Reports suggest that Netanyahu, he was under pressure from his own right-wing coalition, and he tried to change the terms of the IDF withdrawal right at the last minute. Basically, he wanted to keep more troops in Gaza. Hamas wasn't having it.
So it was like they took one step forward and then two steps back.
Exactly. This kind of back and forth, it just shows how delicate these negotiations are. The fact that they're back at the table now with a similar deal, well, it means they're at least willing to try again. But those old tensions, they could easily resurface, and that's something to watch out for.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. Okay, so let's talk about the next phase of the agreement, the humanitarian aid. The articles talk about a lot more aid being allowed into Gaza now, but rebuilding after a conflict like this, it's about more than just sending supplies, isn't it? What's the plan here, and what are the hurdles they're facing?
The deal says that Israel will allow 600 trucks of humanitarian aid into Gaza every day. That's a big increase compared to what they were letting in before, and it's crucial for those immediate needs.
Right.
Food, water, medical supplies, stuff to rebuild with, they need it all. But you're right, the long-term challenge, it's rebuilding those homes, schools, hospitals, entire neighborhoods that were destroyed.
It's a huge undertaking, and it makes you wonder about accountability, effectiveness, How do they make sure the aid gets to the people who need it most, and that it's actually used properly?
That's a key point. They need transparency. They need accountability. The deal talks about international cooperation, with Qatar playing a big role in coordinating the aid and reconstruction efforts. The UN will be involved, and NGOs, international donors, all of them. But besides just rebuilding physically, there's the emotional and psychological impact of the conflict to deal with. And they need to create opportunities for economic growth, for stability.
It's about rebuilding lives, not just buildings. But with so much aid pouring in, there's always the risk of corruption, things getting mismanaged.
No doubt about it. The agreement calls for oversight, mechanisms to track the aid and make sure it's effective. But it'll take constant attention from the international community, making sure both Israel and Hamas are held accountable for their actions. If they don't, even the best plans can fall apart.
All right, so we've talked about the immediate needs, but what about the bigger picture? What does this agreement say about a permanent ceasefire, a real lasting peace in the region?
That's a goal, of course, but it's also the hardest to achieve. This agreement doesn't lay out specifics for a permanent ceasefire. Instead, it's like setting the stage for more talks, and those will probably be even harder than the ones that got them to this point.
You said earlier that peace needs more than just stopping the fighting. What are the deeper issues, the things that make it so tough to find a lasting solution?
This isn't just about what's happened recently. This is decades of animosity, deeply entrenched positions, fundamental disagreements over land, security, identity. These are the things that have fueled this conflict for generations.
So how do you even begin to address those deeper problems, the ones that are so much more complex?
That's the million-dollar question, right? This agreement, it doesn't have all the answers. Think of it like a roadmap, a framework for future talks. The details, they'll have to be hammered out through negotiations, and that's going to be a long, tough road.
It sounds like this ceasefire, it's just the beginning of a much bigger story. A moment of hope, maybe, but the real drama is still to come.
That's a good way to put it. And how it all ends, it's far from certain. It depends on a lot of things, whether both sides really want peace, what the international community does, and maybe most importantly, whether the people on both sides are ready for a different future.
And speaking of the international community, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, the incoming Trump administration and what they've said they want to do. Trump's been pretty clear. He wants to use this ceasefire to expand the Abraham Accords, even bringing Saudi Arabia into the mix. What would that mean, and is it even possible?
The Abraham Accords, that was a major diplomatic win, getting Israel and some Arab countries to normalize relations. But adding Saudi Arabia, that would be a whole different ballgame. Saudi Arabia, they're the most influential Arab country. They're the guardians of Islam's holiest sites. If they made peace with Israel, it would be a huge deal. Symbolically and strategically, it could completely change the Middle East.
It sounds like it could set off a chain reaction, change all the alliances in the region.
It's a big possibility, but there are a lot of hurdles, too. Saudi Arabia has its own interests. They've said they won't normalize relations with Israel unless there's a real chance for a Palestinian state. Even with Trump pushing for it, there's no guarantee they'll go along.
So there are a lot of moving parts, and it's really hard to say what will happen. But even with all the difficulties and potential problems, there's a little bit of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time.
It's a cautious hope, you know. We have to remember that real peace, it takes more than just signing a piece of paper. It takes a change in how people think, a willingness to leave the past behind and build something new based on understanding, empathy, a shared vision for a better future.
That's a good thought to keep in mind as we watch how this all plays out. But for now, let's take stock of what we've learned. We've looked at the details of this agreement, the roles of the key players, the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. What are the main takeaways for our listeners, the things they should keep in mind as they process all this information?
What I find most interesting is how this whole situation, the ceasefire, it shows how interconnected everything is in the world. It's a microcosm of all the forces that shape our lives. War, peace, diplomacy, power. It reminds us that these events, even if they seem far away, they can have a ripple effect that we all feel.
It's easy to feel detached from these conflicts, but really, they touch on some fundamental parts of being human. Our capacity for both conflict and cooperation, our desire for safety and stability, and our responsibility to create a more peaceful, just world.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important. It's not just about understanding the specific agreement, it's about thinking about the bigger questions it raises. Questions about power, diplomacy, human rights, the nature of peace itself.
And those questions, well, those are the ones we'll keep exploring as this story continues to unfold. We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up our deep dive, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. And we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into the Gaza ceasefire. We've gone through the agreement, looked at who's involved, considered what could happen next. But I want to go back to something you said before about how fragile peace can be, especially in a region with so much history. What makes this situation so likely to fall apart?
Yeah, that historical context is key. This isn't just a random event. It's part of a decades-long conflict with a lot of animosity built up over time. These articles we've been reading, they don't sugarcoat that. They talk about past ceasefires that failed, negotiations that broke down, and a lack of trust that seems to run deep between Israel and Hamas. Makes you wonder, can they ever really achieve lasting peace?
It's a question a lot of people are asking right now. But even with all that pessimism, all that history, are there any signs that things might be different this time? Can we find anything hopeful in this agreement?
That's what makes it so interesting. Even with all those setbacks in the past, there are some glimmers of hope in this deal. The fact that both sides were willing to come to the table, to give a little, to talk, that suggests maybe things are changing.
It's not about being naive. It's about recognizing that even in the toughest situations, there's always a possibility for things to improve.
Right. And that's where the idea of choice comes in. Both sides have decisions to make. They can hold on to the past, keep the cycle of violence going, or they can take this chance to break free, create a new path.
And that power to choose, that agency, it's not just for the leaders, right? It applies to regular people on both sides, too.
Absolutely. Peace isn't just something governments make happen behind closed doors. It's something people build together every day through their actions, their choices, and their willingness to understand the other side, to see things from their perspective.
So this ceasefire, it's more than just a deal. It's a test, a chance for everyone to step up and play a part in creating a more peaceful world.
Exactly. And that part doesn't have to be some big heroic thing. It can be as simple as talking to people who see things differently, challenging our own assumptions, getting information from a variety of sources. It's about recognizing that we're all human, even when there's conflict.
That's a powerful message, a good one to leave our listeners with. It reminds us that even when we're facing problems that seem impossible to solve, we all have the power to make a difference.
We do. And that power we have together, that shared ability to act, that might be the strongest force for change there is.
Well, thank you for joining me on this deep dive. This has been a really insightful conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, and stay engaged with what's happening in the world. The future is uncertain, but one thing's for sure. We all have a role to play in shaping it.